All right, well, let's kick off. We've got some really, really big issues to talk about tonight. I'll let the speakers properly introduce themselves, but I just want to say at the outset that we've got Shane Sodhi, who's the president of the Adelaide Parklands Association, Marty Keelans, I hope I'm saying your name right, who is on the executive of WACRA, the Western Adelaide Coastal Residents Association, Michelle Hogan, who's on the executive of the Port Adelaide National Trust, and Diane Bennett, the interim president of CASA, the Community Alliance of South Australia. And I see quite a few CASA members here tonight. So I'm going to go to Shane first, who I think is a presentation for us. So thanks for joining us, Shane.
Thanks very much, Paz. As Marty said, I'm president of the Adelaide Parklands Association, and some of the other speakers may be talking about tactics, but I want to share some insights that we've gained in the last few years about strategy, because strategy comes before tactics. Everybody has something that they want to share, to protect, and this is what we're concerned with, the Adelaide Parklands. And we came to the view a few years ago that the parklands will be protected only when a sufficient number of people demand that they are protected. We don't have a sufficient number yet. That's obvious from the attacks that are still continuing on the Adelaide Parkland. Some of you might remember this. This was our logo for a very long time. And a couple of years ago, somebody just came up with a suggestion at our AGM, why don't we get a better logo or a newer logo? And that rather innocuous suggestion got us going on rather a long journey. Started with the idea of a logo. I had a go at designing a new one, and I'm pretty crap at that. So people didn't like my suggestions, and that in hindsight, they were very wise not to like my suggestions. So we obtained professional assistance on a rebranding strategy. And the first thing we got told by branding consultants was the logo comes last. Think deeper than just a logo. What do you want to be known for? What is your reputation? I think quite often we're considered as people who just chatted away. We were all talk, no action. And this cartoon in the Sunday Mail, or the Advertiser, really hit home to me. Valdis considered us, the cartoonists, considered us a freak show. And I thought long and hard about the fact that this was how we were perceived. On the fringes of society, people did not take us seriously. We were complaining. So we started a strategic plan, because that comes before branding and logo. And one of the first things we were told by other people who know what they're talking about is that you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. We had to be more inclusive because we wanted to attract these people as our future members and future Parkland supporters. So instead of thinking about what we opposed, we started with this really fundamental question. What do we support? What is the thing that we love, that we want to protect? And so we came up with this benchmark, and we've been relying on this ever since. It's actually a very simple concept, 3 overlapping circles: open, green, public. Various land uses might be open, but they're not green and public. And other land uses might be public, but they're not open and green. Obviously, not every part of the Adelaide Parklands is open, green and public, but this became our benchmark so that we weren't coming up with an ad hoc response to every proposed development on Parklands. We were always referring back to this. Is it open, green, public, or is it at least 2 out of those 3? Once we developed the benchmark, we then tried to develop a strategic plan about what we do, also what we don't do, mission creep, and who we are. And we came up with these potential hooks for potential supporters. What would draw them in to becoming more involved in the Adelaide Parklands? We wanted people to explore the Parklands. If they were exploring, we thought they would be inspired. If they were inspired, we thought they'd want to protect and or restore. So those are the 4 hooks on which our strategic plan was based. Then we had to decide whether our name needed to be changed. What name would best fit our strategic plan? We've got all of these different ideas: Friends of, Defenders, Lovers, Progress Association. The one thing we didn't want to continue with was the word preservation, because preserving is for fruit and veggies. It suggests no change ever, not even positive, open, green, public change. So we ditched the word preservation and we merely called ourselves the Adelaide Parklands Association, which is a generic name that can fit in any future strategic plan. Only then were we ready for a branding consultant. And we consulted these 4 organisations, partnerships, firms within Adelaide, and we picked this one. Her name is Abra Renfrey, and she leads a branding consultancy called Detour Design. She did a lot of research. She got 319 people to answer questions. What's your age range, your gender, your postcode? How often do you visit any part of the Parklands? How often do you use them? And then they developed a creative brief. Are you happy with this brief? They asked us. Yes. These are the goals for a creative brief. They looked at the Adelaide Parklands, developed some colours that were sympathetic with the idea of parks, and they came up. This is the concept that they came up with. That's the outline of Adelaide around the Parklands. Turn that on its edge. And Abra said, that's too much of a gift to ignore. You just put another fold on the top and it becomes not just the Adelaide outline, but a heart. And so the branding message became that heart, which indicates love your Parklands. And why do we love our Parklands? Because they're so tiny. There's only 0.2% of the Adelaide metro area that's Adelaide Parklands. There's another 326,000 hectares that isn't. And our 4 hooks that I mentioned earlier, explore, inspire, protect, restore, they got their own variations of the logo. So every time we talk about anything to do with the Parklands, we're using that logo, that heart shape. That shows what we believe in. And it's always a positive message, because whether we're talking about exploring, inspiring, protecting, or restoring, there's always a heart in it. We explore with guided walks, online trail guides. Every couple of weeks, there's a guided walk in the Parklands. So we're not just talking, we're doing. That's the important thing. Park ambassadors, 1 for each park, nearly. We also inspire. I mentioned that comes after explore, inspire. We run the Adelaide Parklands Art Prize, which is a huge effort, $50,000 prize money. We had an opening night. We run this every 2 years, so it's currently underway at the moment for the 2023 edition. That's our overall winner. Dan Withy took home $20,000 for his first prize painting, which is called the Parklands and the Hungry Developer. We run an Instagram feed every single day. There is at least one picture of the Parklands on our Instagram feed, but protecting is probably the main thing, the thing that we still do as much as we ever have, drawing attention to threats, endorsing pro-park election candidates and aligning with like-minded groups. This is just one of the current threats that are around. There's many more. I could speak a long time about that, but I'm not going to. We also post on Facebook and Twitter pretty much every day, if not more than once a day, and bi-monthly email newsletter twice every month, which includes stories about exploring, inspiring, protecting and restoring. The rebranding has been spectacularly successful. We have more than doubled the number of people coming to our website. We've more than doubled our membership. So I consider that a success. That's a strategic success that comes from planning properly first about what you stand for and what you believe in. In City Council supplementary elections, we're 2 from 2. These are the candidates that we supported in supplementary elections, and they both got elected, which was quite a surprise, but that's good. And alliances with like-minded projects and groups that we're always pursuing, including with the National Trust. Not only that, we're restoring. We've got our own regreening project, which is partly underway. Keep pushing for council and state government restorations, and we do twice yearly park cleanup days. This little spot here, we've been given permission to put in a garden. Still working through the City Council procedures to get what we want to do approved, but it's underway. And we ran a poster design competition for that. So it's involving the community as much as possible. And in terms of restore, we've been campaigning to restore Helen Mayo Park and Kate Cox Park, where the state government now wants to put a $3 billion hospital and 8-storey car park, and park cleanup days, which I already mentioned. So that's what we do, and I think I've pretty much explained why we do it. It's a strategy that I think could cross over into, the broad strategy to adapt to your own needs in your own area, but hopefully that will help.
Great, thank you very much, Shane. I think that's a really clear and powerful way to kick off tonight. Your pretty compelling story of going back to basic principles and a positive vision, and how an organization can kind of redefine and rebrand itself. And I think it's a very good segue actually for our next speaker, Marty from the Western Adelaide Coastal Residents Association. And just a reminder to the people who've just recently joined us, we're hearing from Shane from the Adelaide Parklands Association. We just heard from him. Now we have Marty from the Western Adelaide Community Residents Association, followed by Michelle from the Port Adelaide National Trust, and then Diane from the Community Alliance. And then after that, we're going to open it up to all of you, because I know there's some very experienced and competent and passionate heritage and planning advocates in the room. So there should be a chance for all of us to contribute to the discussion. But I'm going to go to Marty next from WACRA.
Thanks, Baz, and thank you, Shane. That was very inspiring. It's quite some exciting developments over the time that you've worked on that. Yes, a lot to take away from there. I'm a member of the Western Adelaide Coastal Residents Association Executive and editor of the WACRA Messenger. I've worked mainly in community development over my career, particularly at the local community areas. It's also included about 5 years managing TAFE programs on the APY lands, with a focus primarily on governance, and was part of a campaign to save our Henley Beach Library. And I'm currently writing a series of comics about my childhood for my spare time. I'd like to spend about 5 minutes just talking about the question of campaigns from a process perspective. There's going to be quite a lot of information about particular strategies and issues with regard to campaigns, I think. And it doesn't matter whether we're working on protecting the South Australian heritage or just trying to save one tree. Every campaign has 3 core components: the specifics of the particular problem, the policy decisions that are being made, the stakeholders, the government agencies involved. There is the question of the strategy for managing the campaign. And the third is the tools for keeping us on track and sustaining that campaign. And I'd like to briefly focus on 2 and 3 there, the strategies and tools. Now, we all know the adage, those who fail to plan to fail. And it follows, therefore, that we increase our chances of success if we've got a documented strategy, which involves making choices about what we're going to do, as well as what we're not going to do, which is something that Shane raised in terms of thinking about where the organisation is going. The approach I try and take is, before tackling any challenge, I'd like to complete the statement that I will know that I've succeeded when, and then list the measurable outcomes that represent that success. The next step is having clear milestones and breaking down that campaign down into the winnable stages that can really help. I recently read a book by Stuart Truman called All the Way Around. Now, he paddled a kayak solo 17,000 kilometres around Australia in 16 months back in 2010. One stretch, the Zydork Cliffs south of Denham, involved a 30-hour non-stop paddle because there was nowhere to land. So he had to sit 6 kilometres offshore. And there were 200 kilometres of 200-metre high cliffs, and that was before he got to the Great Australian Bight. So he could never think about that journey as a whole, but rather as a series of small, achievable chunks. In his case, they were 5 6-hour segments, each broken down into 1-hour milestones, when he might have a banana sandwich or a muesli bar at those times. In addition to those goals and tactics involved in any campaigns, we need to be really, really clear about who are our allies in this process and who are our enemies. How can they help us or hinder us, and how we can work with them. The message and content. I have to keep reminding ourselves that most of the time our audiences are not paying attention. They don't spend a lot of time thinking about politics. And so in terms of communication, that understanding has to be uppermost in our minds. Turning to the issue of tools for sustaining our campaigns, there are 3, in my mind, 3 key questions. They include: what will keep people working on our campaigns engaged? How can we make that process a bit of fun? And what are the tactics that won't wear us down? We all need nourishment, and to keep reminding ourselves that only together are we all strong. Some of the options, from my experience of keeping teams engaged, include regular checks on everyone's load and commitment, making sure that the load is shared, and that's a conscious thing that has to be happening regularly, not just assumed. Finding ways to reward people for what they're doing and having regular collegiate activities to keep up spirits. When new people come in, giving them a manageable job to do as soon as they start so that they can get a positive payoff. Pairing new people with a mentor and providing them with induction and shared tribal knowledge, e.g. the politics of the people, personalities inside and outside the group. This has been one of the biggest issues that I found, particularly when working on the APY lands, that was one of the barriers to people maintaining engagement and surviving the long haul. Engaging people with specific skills to the problem who are not part of the organisation or committee to write, contribute or edit submissions of campaign documents. In probably almost all the successful campaigns that I've been involved in, there's always been 2 or 3 people from outside the core group who have been happy to come in for a sort of a consultancy and help with a particular project and then be able to go on with their lives. Engaging people at meetings and forums. It's very common and very natural for us to, when we have a general meeting or a public meeting or anything like that, to talk to the people that we are familiar with, the people within our circle. And it's really important to give committee members or members of the organisation the job of striking up conversations with new attendees and people who are not part of the inner circle, working on skill spotting and recruitment, particularly in the technology area. In many of the organisations that I've been involved in, there's been a big gap in having people with technological insights and skills. And even if we just bring them in on an ad hoc basis, just reminding us that things are changing and that we need those tools. And finally, the issue of celebrating milestones. Now, this is a really brief overview of this, what I think is a very big topic and more of a checklist, really. The important thing is to consciously engage with the issues and to revisit progress regularly. It's sort of like conducting an ongoing campaign health check. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. That was terrific. And I know very, very timely when there's probably like a fair few of us on Zoom who are, feeling a bit tired, who are feeling like we've got a bit of submission fatigue. We've been fighting the same campaigns on these issues for a very, very long time. So I hope many of you find Marty's remarks useful, and I'm sure there'll be opportunities during discussion, like to talk some more about, how do we sustain organizations during times when the fight is long and, our victories could sometimes seem few and far between. I want to go now to Michelle Hogan, who's from the Port Adelaide branch of the National Trust. Over to you, Michelle.
Thanks, Beth. And thank you for the recognition of land. I also am Zooming you from Ghana land. When Paz originally approached me to be involved, it was partly because of my link with the council election, the forthcoming council elections, and my past experience as a councillor for the Port Adelaide Council. But I've also been an active community and union organiser and have been on the executive of our local branch of the National Trust in the Port of Adelaide in a range of positions for many years. So I thought I might talk about our branch and how we have worked and how we have picked up some of the issues that both Marty and Shane have been talking about in terms of regrouping and organising ourselves to be more effective. So our branch formed to campaign primarily around the waterfront redevelopment in Port Adelaide. And we were very specific in that we were interested in the maintenance of maritime and working class heritage. So we invited Jack Mundy, which some of you may remember, the BLF union organiser who was famous for saving the Sydney Rocks area in the heyday of union power, doing that sort of thing by doing green bans, which of course is now illegal. We were suitably inspired by Jack's campaign and his enthusiasm for heritage and for community action. And so we formed a branch and have specifically remained an advocacy branch rather than running as a lot of National Trust, not all, but a lot of National Trust branches are devoted to running particular facilities and maintaining particular collections of heritage items. We've run a number of advocacy campaigns, and we've certainly felt the pain of losing many campaigns, and we almost folded due to the resultant loss of enthusiasm from our members. A lot of you may remember our more recent campaign around Shed 26. And also, we've just been running a campaign around Shed 1, which is also known as Fisherman's Wharf, which is the last original shed on the inner harbour, and sadly is in private hands and has been approved for demolition. We had a very interesting experience under the new development code in presenting around that demolition application, in which the panel basically gave us the feedback that if they had the capacity under the legislation, they would have stopped the demolition, but they had no capacity. So it was a really interesting illustration of the need to work at several levels in a campaign. And it's why we have always attempted to not only work at a local level, but also at a systems change level. But it also picks up the points that Marty has been making in terms of the need to keep people involved and enthusiastic, because that campaign, and even the most recent one, has had the effect of, disillusioning a lot of members who were previously very involved, and a lot of loss of enthusiasm. And so I suppose one of the things that I've done and have brought to my work as a community activist is, my past union activist training, which used a model of anger, hope, and action. Anger's always a good motivator. It gets people going and stirred up, and invariably it involves, someone else should do something about that. Hope is where you are tapping into a bigger picture, making the individual connection, inspiring that something could be different. And action, of course, is that translation of both into an achievable campaign. And Marty talked about achievable chunks, and that's certainly what we've tried to do. It's also really important to make sure that you do move on from anger and, from its flip side, depression. I moved in with a Buddhist some years ago, and anger has come under critical review in our household. It's been important for me as I spend a lot of time being angry, and under previous governments, a lot of time feeling depressed about our ability to make change. Despair is never good, and I think a lot of activists are increasingly stuck in despair. It's hard to avoid. It's debilitating, and it alienates people from taking action and being involved in change. It basically makes people feel powerless and defeatist. When our branch regrouped, we cut back on our actions and, importantly, our meetings to what we thought we would cover. We did what Shane described in the Parklands work of looking at our planning and our strategic direction. We also looked at what Marty was explaining in terms of a review of individual load and where we could use people's best skills, because we basically worn people out. We learned how to say no, not to have a great big list of campaigns. And we identified clear priority. We opened up new ways of meeting. quarterly Zoom in homes, and of expanding ways of being involved. Members might just join in a campaign rather than, for that project, rather than our general committee meetings. And we concentrated a bit more on having more fun. Some of that celebration, some of the funny and amusing actions that, could engage a different range of people. So picking up with the working with council and Paz's point about wanting people to be engaged with the forthcoming local elections, it's been an interesting experience in establishing who has power in development applications. And like I explained with our experience with Shed 1, we've found that while individual councillors always say they are pro-heritage, well, at least ours do, and we agree as a branch that that doesn't necessarily mean that you are not also pro-development. I think both can happen. These councillors don't tend to have an agenda of their own, but are more responsive to what comes up. Often they say, I'm here to represent the community. But imagine if, state and local governments use that position. People elect you because you have an agenda. I certainly expect people to be representing an agenda of action. And what being responsive means is that their work is always reactive and spasmodic, which often it is on council and certainly for a lot of councillors. But that's not a very effective way of implementing a strategy. We want councillors who subscribe to an agenda of action on heritage, specific action, and who can name that agenda and be accountable for the achievements against it. Similarly, we've found that our lobbying of council staff has been less effective when done spasmodically, and we've moved to establishing a regular quarterly meeting with key council staff as a more effective way of exchanging information and monitoring action. And we've deliberately kept that agenda specific. So instead of adding new things on every time, we have kept to a consistent agenda to hold people to that agenda. So that's been quite important because, we'd all like to change everything, but we have been we've tried to be a bit more strategic in terms of not reacting to every issue that arises, but planning ahead and working on longer term campaigns. And we've certainly found that fighting the long fight is a key part of holding people accountable to slow change, because that's invariably what it is. We've very consciously developed partnerships with other groups to add to the critical mass of our campaigns. So we've stayed with a number, just to give you some examples, on the waterfront development, we've certainly developed a range of partnerships, and most recently with our local history society, which hasn't been a very politically active nor advocating society up until now. In the past, we've worked on the quarantine station out at Torrens Island, and we established a very good partnership with the Friends of Torrens Island. And more recently, the current campaign that I'm working on is around significant trees. As you know, National Trust has a natural heritage as well as built heritage brief. And when I went to have a look at even the National Trust's list of significant trees in the West, there were only one listing, and that was for the palms that run down the centre of Port Road. So I know from personal experience that the subdivision of land in this area is resulting in significant trees, and even trees that are trying to be significant, being knocked over. And a lot of those trees are held on private land. So this project is working with the community to identify significant trees and campaign for their preservation. And I've got a quick presentation on that if we have time later, or if it's an area of interest for people, we can revisit it. But rather than take up discussion time I'll let us move on for our next speaker, because personally I'm very interested in what you've got to say as well, Don. So I'll end it there. Thanks, Paz.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Really terrific presentation. I think, picking and choosing campaigns and learning the importance of less is more is a lesson that, like all of us, are grappling with when there's so many different fronts to fight on. It feels like we're being attacked from multiple directions, and totally hear you on the need for less meeting. 100% behind that. That's something we've been crawling out. I want to go to our last speaker before we open it up to the room, and she's Diane Bennett, who's the interim president of the Community Alliance of South Australia. And I note that there's quite a few Community Alliance members here on Zoom tonight, and it's terrific to have all of you here. So over to you, Diane.
Thanks a lot, Paz, and thanks everybody for your time here this evening. It's great to see you all here. I am working with the committee, and I notice that Tom and Crystal and Sandy are here as well, to the Community Alliance going until November when we have our AGM. And it was formed really as an umbrella organisation for a number of community groups back in 2011, and I was the founding president along with Tom and a couple of other people on the committee to really get to the root cause of problems. Many of the community groups were at that point very concerned about development, planning issues and heritage, destruction of heritage. And we decided that the only way things were going to change was to get to the root cause, which was to change the planning laws in the state. And that's what CASA was set up to do. And it's terrific to see, after 10 years of strong leadership from Tom and then Crystal and last year Iris, that the fundamental principles of CASA are still retained, in that changes to planning are really needed to ensure we protect our heritage and to stop some of the really crazy developments that go ahead continuously and that drive us crazy. I just want to talk briefly about a good example of protecting heritage in my role as chairperson of the Mount Barker and District Residents Association, because I like to work on community engagement strategies. And just recently, Sandy and I have engaged with the State Planning Commission chair and a couple of people from the department to talk through issues around the changes to the technical amendment, miscellaneous code technical amendments, which were all entirely technical except for a couple of policy matters. The policy matters were very much heritage-based. Sandy and I went together as a team, and Sandy is, as you all know, an expert in heritage matters. And I can't speak too highly of that knowledge and the gift of being able to present that knowledge to someone like Craig, I think it's Craig Holland, I've just forgotten his name for the minute, who sat and listened very intently. But while Sandy spoke about the heritage matters and the importance of retaining heritage in the code and raising it to a better level, I talked about the community engagement part of the work that the Commission's trying to do. And I take on board Shane's comment about catch more flies with honey, that activity of engaging with senior leaders in the state government and actually meeting with them and proactively working with them to try and find the way that you can come up with mutually agreeable solutions, I think is a very good approach to take. And that example that Sandy and I have been working on will continue with the committee working through this expert panel's planned changes or consultation process coming up. But the example I wanted to speak briefly about at Mount Barker, where I've been on the executive for 25 years, and I almost feel like I'm due for a party of some sort. Carol's here, Carol Bailey. She's been on there longer than me, so she probably deserves the party more than me. But we've been working at Mount Barker in all that time on planning and development matters, but also other matters, and a lot of them heritage. And we're very lucky that that district and its towns and settlements really values heritage and the heritage buildings and trees, significant trees. They love their trees, and a good thing too. But in 2003, through the work that Iris did as a consultant, plus a couple of other people, we actually went through a planning amendment process which Council initiated, a heritage DPA, and we were able to get quite a few hundred, I think it was up to 600 buildings out of not artefacts, but gates and some trees listed onto a heritage register, both for local heritage and contributory items. That process engaged the community. It raised a few people's anger because they didn't want consultants stepping on their plot of land to look at the state of their house. But the end result actually was a really terrific outcome that has actually helped to preserve quite a lot of heritage buildings in Mount Barker. And more recently, I think 2 years ago, there was another update to that DPA for local heritage listing, and we were able to add another 20 or 30 items, again through community consultation, to that listing. So there can be some good results that through the engagement of the community and working with council and consultants, where we can actually have some really great results. And I'm a half glass full kind of person and always want to look at the positive. I'm never going to let the bastards get me down, kind of thing. So we've just got to keep on going. So, you know, we've been showing at Mount Barker that there is really some good practices around heritage retention that have stood us in good stead and provide some really good practice examples. With Community Alliance, the work that the member groups do is terrific, and the umbrella organisation brings together all of these groups that have like-minded principles and objectives. And again, if we can together as a team, again, going back to catching more flies with honey, meet with senior leaders in government, meet with the expert panel, talk to the chairs of committees, you know, we keep on writing, but I actually think showing the examples of the impact of bad planning laws is a really powerful message. And when Sandy was able to show Craig Holland these examples of what happened to heritage buildings when the wrong planning decision was made and how alternatives could have protected that building, you know, Craig was quite astounded by that. And so were the two department guys, because they sit in these ivory towers and they make these decisions and they write these documents. But actually, other than the street they live in and maybe the street they cruise around in occasionally, they don't really know the impact on the communities in a real tangible sense. And I think Community Alliance SA has a great potential to fulfil that role. And so hopefully in the coming months, with the capture of feedback for the expert panel's discussion paper, information was released today, get onto that mailing list if you're not on it. The opportunity to consult has commenced, and we will seek really valuable and valid examples of where the planning laws have made terrible, the outcomes of the planning laws have made terrible mistakes. What we're trying to do ultimately is have a seat at the table. And Tom, who was a founding member, talks to me about this a lot, and I believe with him wholeheartedly. If we can have a seat at the table where not only developers and the planning industry and local government are sitting and talking with the government, but actually community organisations are a part of that conversation up front and in the initial stages, I think it can only be for the betterment of our communities. So I think that's really all I wanted to say today, and never give up, that we just have to keep going. Thanks,
thank you. Thank you, Diane. I think two really important messages. We absolutely have to have a seat at the table. We deserve to have a seat at the table. It's our communities and our neighbourhoods that are being profoundly affected by the current planning regime, and of course to never ever give up. And you heard from all four speakers tips about how to sustain organisations and movements, how to avoid the challenges of burnout and demoralisation, tips around staying true to your positive vision and knowing what campaigns to fight and what campaigns to pass on, and being clear about what it is you want, and avoiding the dangers of too many meetings, and many other useful tips. For those who joined the Zoom late, we did record all four of the presentations from Shane from the Parklands Association, Marty from the Western Adelaide Coastal Residents Association, Michelle from the Port Adelaide National Trust, and Diane from the Community Alliance. So those presentations will be available later on. But in the meantime, I wanted to open it up because I know we've got 52 people here. We've got some people who've been heritage and planning campaigners for a very, very long time, and I'm keen to hear from all of you. Your reflections on the situation we're in, the window of opportunity, maybe a somewhat narrow window of opportunity around planning and heritage and reform. Your reflections on local heritage campaigns, whether they were successful or unsuccessful. So there's been some really terrific questions and comments already. I'm going to open it up And if you've got like any questions for any of the speakers, feel free to indicate and we'll get to as many people tonight as we can. Diane, looks like the first question for you is about the Community Alliance.
I might ask for Crystal's help on this one. The fundamental principles, actually, and this is again going back to the initiation of the Community Alliance, most of the groups, if not all of them back then, and probably even more so now, had issues that were very much focused on planning and development catastrophes, terrible things that happened in their communities. And we really came down to the fundamental of, well, we have to change the planning and development code and act at some point, or try and influence change through that, because that was the root cause of all of these bad decisions through councils, development assessment panels at that time, now council assessment panels, I think. Carol has been a member of one of those groups on council for a long time and knows the absolute frustration of trying to try and change development applications, but as a single councillor on a CAP, it's impossible, almost impossible, I think. So the Community Alliance groups really, although they all have their own particular local area issues, which is good, and they continue to fight for those, they are fundamentally supporting Community Alliance's goal to change planning law to improve outcomes for communities in any region of South Australia. Would I have captured that correctly, Crystal and Sandy and Tom?
Yes, and it's crucial that engaging with the member groups is challenging, and getting the member groups to join the committee at times so we can take turns and reduce that burnout is important. I have to say that the partnerships is so important with advocacy, especially for Community Alliance. We don't have the paid staff that the property developers do. We don't have political donations to give. So we are going uphill, but we do have voters behind us, and we do have the community support. So I do stress it's very important that we engage with our partners, our community groups, but we all need to help each other in that. I experienced extreme burnout my 3 years. So it's important that we do help each other, give each other a pat in the back. And if we do express a view, that we consult with each other, that we all agree on that view and stick together for the big prize, which is hopefully better planning.
Thank you, Crystal. There's a question in the Zoom chat from Charlie, a very important question. How do we include Aboriginal heritage as part of our campaigning and advocacy work? I know this is a question that the National Trust has been starting to grapple with, and quite a challenging question. So I'm just going to put that out there if any of our speakers or anyone else might like to address this question, particularly if we have any First Nations people in the room here tonight. We would absolutely love to hear your perspective on this.
Hi, Paz. I suppose one of the things that we've done in our branch is recognise that as a crowd of, predominantly white people, we're probably not going to be all that successful in just pulling in Indigenous activists. And in fact, what we should be doing is supporting their initiatives and letting those agencies lead the way. And so we've concentrated on partnership approaches with our local Aboriginal Advisory Committee, which is connected to the local council, and they are leading that work and we take their instructions. So it's going to be a hard push, and it, I think, is a slow process. We've also been much more conscious of attempting that engagement and ensuring that there is that invitation, and we are still doing a lot of education ourselves.
I'd just like to mention that the City of Charles Sturt recently put out a draft economic plan, and in our submission to that plan, we noted that looking at the census data, that there were a significant proportion of Aboriginal people living in the City of Charles Sturt area, and also that there were a significant number of areas of the city that have some significance in terms of Indigenous heritage. And one of the things that we asked them to do was for the council to take an active role in consulting with this community, because all the economic development initiatives are primarily focused on economic growth. And there was no real thought to the wider heritage issues and their impact on the economic landscape, which is not necessarily just about money. And I think it is an important role that councils need to play, is to look carefully at the demographic and recognise that there are other constituencies.
Thank you, Marty. There's quite a few Zoom questions in the chat. I'll try to get to as many of these questions as we can. Moira Weir, who's a candidate for mayor for the city of Onkaparinga, has asked, what do you think are the most important ways that the role of mayor can offer support into the heritage and planning processes? A good chance to talk about what we want from local government.
Are there any mayors here? Let's ask them.
It's a very good question. I know there's a few candidates here. I suspect.
Yes,
There's a few of us here. Why don't we see if any of the speakers want to respond first? And then, given we do have a few candidates and at least one current mayor in the room, maybe we can hear briefly from all of you. But I'll go first to if Diane, Michelle, Marty, or Shane want to pick up this question about, what do we want from local government in the heritage protection space? And then we can go to David and anyone else from local government who might like to briefly comment.
Well, I suppose we definitely want to see how the issue of heritage is reflected in council strategic plans. I mean, one of the big areas has been under the past development applications, what happens to heritage in development applications, and things like having a heritage strategy, devoting staff to heritage advisors, etc., having a strong and public commitment to heritage are some of the things that we'd be looking for.
Great, thank you, Michelle.
I just think
Diane?
we'd be looking for leadership in that space. And I'm interested in maybe hearing from David how that's provided.
All right, David, do you want to comment on what you've heard?
Yeah, happy to jump in, and thanks to the forum and the speakers. There's some real gems of advice in there. I'll speak as a mayor, but just to let you know that I'm also the president of the Art Deco and Modernism Society, and we have our own campaigns running, and we're working across every council to see where they're at with their heritage listing process. And surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, some don't even have a local heritage register whatsoever. Which raises questions about why not. But from a council perspective, absolutely, you should be making sure your council has it in their long-term strategy. Every council by law has to form a community plan or a strategic plan. After the election, it has to run for at least 4 years. A lot of councils are pushing it out to run for much longer and refreshing it every term, but by law, they have to have one. They also have to have an annual business plan, and within that, they have to have a 10-year long-term financial plan. Unfortunately, local heritage listing costs money. Some of that's good money and some of it's really frustrating. Part of the good money would be, I would encourage any community that's serious to lobby their council to say, you've really got to help people and have a small heritage grants fund. And if you can, a heritage advisor. Our council has a grants fund, which is always oversubscribed, but we don't have an advisor, which is a bit sad, but we can't afford everything. The other part of the process is that the local listing process is hideously complex and long, and we're very frustrated about that. So with my third hat with the Local Government Association Board, I've been the key liaison person with the Minister and the other key bodies in negotiating the reforms. And suffice to say, we haven't got everything we want, but we continue to work very hard on it. And knowing what I do from the Art Deco Society, I know that this is the state heritage process. I'll just do that. There we go. So I've documented it because I couldn't find it really documented anywhere else. And you can see that there are 13 steps on there. Okay. So anyone can lodge a state heritage application. It doesn't mean you'll win, but anyone can lodge it. The local government process, I started documenting it because I didn't understand why it was so complex and painful. There's page 1 and there's page 2. And as you can guess, there is another page, which is page 3. So that's 44 steps, okay, for a local council to lodge and win a heritage code amendment. So it must be in long-term strategy because it'll take a very long time for the council to go through all those steps. It must be in their budget because the local government process, which is dictated by the state, insists on the council using external specialist advice. So you have to have a budget to hire these people. Then you've got to have a budget to have someone write up the code amendment and do all the extensive consultation. And some of those costs are, of course, legitimate. But we need to, in our own council, find 40 grand to fund a heritage themes analysis before the department had told us they'll even look at another heritage code amendment, which will cost a further $60,000. So you have to look for a council that not just has it in its strategy, but has it in their long-term financial plan and then brings it forward into their annual plan that sets aside those budget amounts to get the process running. Now, that's setting aside all the local comment that you'll get, but I'm working pretty hard with other interested parties to try and get these processes simplified, and a big backer of the upper house report into reforming of the heritage system to put it under one minister, not two, to have one process, but at two levels, and to make it simpler for local councils. It really is a nightmare. And just in conclusion, the local heritage process makes it impossible for the Art Deco Society to lodge an application for a local listing, but it makes it very easy for us to lodge one under a state heading, which is a higher order listing. So it doesn't make any sense from a hierarchical point of view or a resource point of view. So there's just a few comments and what you need to look out for from your council. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I think it was a really useful insight about how baffling and frustrating the heritage protection system is for councils. And quite a few people asked if they could get copies of David's very complicated flowcharts. I'm sure we can circulate them later on for those of you who want to take off half a day to read up through them. So we have quite a few questions in the Zoom chat, but I just want to stay on local government slightly longer and maybe allow for one more contribution on this. Now, I think that Anna has a question that she wants to ask.
Thank you. I'm one of these people that is relatively new to this space of campaigning. You can hopefully see behind me the hall that I'm trying to stop from demolition. It's over 100-year-old school hall at Rosary School in Prospect. So David, bless him, is very familiar with my ranting and raving about this hall. I guess two quick questions. Prospect Local Council or the City of Prospect have conducted heritage surveys over the years, and I'm curious to know, in the absence of a thematic analysis, which is now required under Practice Direction 2, what is the value of heritage analyses that have been, or heritage surveys that have been conducted in the past? Are they worthless in the absence of a thematic analysis? Are they of any benefit now in forming the foundation of a code amendment? I'm no expert in this process, but I'm just trying to find any and all available opportunities to try and protect the hall that you see behind me. And just quickly, the second question is, what steps are being taken in terms of the prevention of demolition ahead of development applications being approved? As far as I can tell, there's nothing to stop the school from demolishing this hall and leaving a giant hole in the ground while all other applications are dealt with.
Thank you, Anna. That sounds like a very specific question for David.
I'm happy to answer it to the extent that I'm aware of what the answer will be. The previous heritage surveys made zero difference when we recently applied to have 45 of our contributory items added to our local heritage listing. The department refused every single one and said, you haven't done a thematic analysis, off you go. So I would say next to useless, even though they're providing different advice to different people. That's been the hard advice back to us and our discussions with the Commissioner. I'm not sure who suggested the thematic analysis solution. I'm not saying it's a bad idea. It just adds another dozen steps to the front of what's already a very complicated process. There's no process to do an urgent listing in local government. You can do it technically on a single building, but it's a pretty frustrating space, to be perfectly frank. The other thing that the local heritage listing process normally does is value things from a streetscape perspective. And that means that you're protecting what the public can see as they walk past or drive past. And that's why it only protects front walls generally. If you want to protect what's behind the front wall and the backyard and anything else, you need a state level listing process which covers everything, including the colour of the paint in the dunny, which is kind of curious. But anyway, I live in a state listed house, so I know these things, right? So the difference between the two levels is quite stark. And a local survey process will generally not look behind what the public can see from the street. And the building Anna's talking about is a really good case in point where it's not visible from the street easily, and therefore it tends to get lost in that local survey approach. It's a pretty frustrating space all round. The only other thing I can suggest that we need to all work on is to try and get demolition controls back. And I've been leveraging the Commissioner on this point to say that there needs to be better demolition controls, not just in heritage conservation zones, but also in character areas And I believe he's receptive to that, and I'm hopeful that that change will occur. And that will give us a little bit more power as a council during the assessment phase to say, well, look, we're not going to approve your new thing until you explain what it's going to be and how it's going to fit in. It's not a protection. It just makes them pay more attention to their new proposal before they knock down the old building. Just sort of add that in as well.
Great. Thank you very much, David. Really terrific contributions on Zoom. Thank you particularly to Jenny for some really important comments. I just want to, as we kind of close up, anyone who'd like to ask a question or make a comment, where do we go from here? I think we'd all back David's comment that some kind of return to demolition controls is absolutely essential. That should be pretty high up on our agendas in terms of what we can get out of the new state government. I'm keeping an eye on the Zoom chat, but at this point, feel free to take yourself off mute if you've got a question or a comment to make. The National Trust will make this recording available. We will put it up online. And if you haven't registered, get in touch with the National Trust and we'll add you to the mailing list and make sure you're kept in the loop. I'll just do a final call out for comments and questions. I know there's a lot of people in this space who've been working on these issues for many years and under many different state governments. They've seen all sorts of terrible things happen to our heritage protections and to the rights of councils and individuals. Carol has her hand up. Over to you.
Carol Bailey, Mount Barker councillor for the past almost 12 years. I'm not running again because I didn't see any point in standing in the chamber and repeating myself over and over again when it's clear that council no longer has any control over heritage planning or over protection for trees. When the Significant and Regulated Tree Act came into place in 2011, it ensured that no tree could be saved, significant or otherwise. This includes Aboriginally culture, significant trees. We identified some when we saw the ministerial DPA coming at us over the hill. These were identified, they were listed. Not all of them have been saved. These were trees which bore special markings that either had a coolamon or a canoe or something like that carved from them. They were identified by what remains of the Paramonk Nation here. Didn't mean they were going to be saved. Development rules, and I am personally devastated and totally fed up with the number of, I've probably gone to over 100 meetings over the past decade, and they've all come to absolutely nothing. We've repeated the same things. There have been hundreds, if not thousands of submissions written. And now we have a situation, and I think South Australia is in a very bad place, where two governments, both Labor and Liberal, have adopted this new planning and design code. And this talk of making changes, where are they? This has gone on now a decade, more than a decade in the making, millions of dollars spent in expert panels, discussions, public consultation, private consultation. It's just gone on and on. And yet the trees are coming down here. They're coming down hundreds at a time here, relentlessly. It's now visible. The exodus of wildlife from the ministerial DPA area is visible. They've got nowhere to go. Things are being lost. We've got conservation people. I went to a lecture the other night by the ex-president, previous president, former president of Birds SA, who said that we're losing woodland birds at an alarming rate. They've just got nowhere to go. So we've only got limited space with these animals and creatures and even reptiles have occupied, and there is just nowhere left for them to go unless we draw a line in the sand and make some provision for where they can go and have shelter belts and parklands. There is no provision for that whatsoever in any of this planning and design code. It's just development rules, and the developers are doing whatever they like. So I'm sad to be so strong on this, but as I said, I stepped down from council confident that I've done as much as I can do, and that I can do as much from the outside as the inside, which is very, very sad situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. And I know that you're one of the people here on Zoom who has been taking on the developers for a very, very long time. So we totally feel your frustration and despair at the huge losses that we've seen, both built heritage and trees and other bits of natural heritage. I saw Pam's comment in the Zoom chat about how can we kind of share the lessons of successful campaigns. I think that's a really great idea. That probably like a resource that the National Trust can put together. And it sounds like CASA might already have a resource like that, and potentially a like a follow-up Zoom.
Yeah. Can I just add that includes 7 years on the Development Assessment Panel and then the so-called CAP, the Council Assessment Panel, which actually is quite independent from council. So it's a bit of a misnomer. One voice there representing all of community for a whole district is just laughable.
Paz, can I just add to that about Carol's frustration, having sat in the chamber and watched her try and bring about change as an elected member, working with a group of colleagues. And this, I think, it's an important question to take to any of your elected member forums. You can only make changes in the chamber if you've got more than half of the vote. So in Mount Barker, you have to have 6 hands in the air to say yes to a change. Now, Carol fought extremely hard on many issues, but if certain members of administration or other areas had persuaded, had conversations and wanted a certain ruling to change and had their way, then any councillors who didn't go along with that couldn't make a difference unless they could get the 6 votes, so 5 others. Sometimes it came down to the casting vote of the mayor, and the mayor at Mount Barker declares publicly she always stays with the status quo. So it's an extremely frustrating position, and I've seen Carol's frustration despite her intelligence and her efforts and her community engagement work. It's been very difficult for her to bring about change. So any of those elected members who are nominating, who get up on the podium and speak to their community and say, yes, I'm going to bring the council rates down, and yes, I'm going to save trees, and yes, I'm going to save heritage. Well, tell me how you're going to do that, and are you going to persuade your other elected members to work with you for those goals? Because that's the only way you get change as a councillor. And thanks, Carol, for all your great work.
Thank you, Carol. And those candidates who are here tonight on Zoom, just reminded the National Trust is currently circulating a survey on planning, environment and heritage. So if you haven't completed our survey, please do. And we still have a few days left. We're very keen to hear from all of you.
Can I just raise one quick thing for those who are former councillors and those intending to run who are current candidates? I have done things as desperate as raise councils interstate, and I'll quote Wilton, west of Sydney, which has drawn a line in the ground and said, no, we're not going to do any more of this rubbish development. We're going to insist on blocks with setback front and rear so that every house can have at least 1 tree and 1 bush. And I'm told over and over again, that's not here. They haven't got the planning and design code. We can't do that. So South Australia, as I said, and I enforce this, is in a very bad place, and something has got to give, or we'll have nothing left. Even food production land is now at risk.
Thank you, Carol, for really making clear how much is at stake. I've just seen Georgie has put her hand up, so I'm going to have one last contribution and then we will have to wrap up. But rest assured, the conversation will continue and we will certainly bring us all together very soon. So Georgie, final comments of the night.
It was more of a question, so I know you have to wrap up. I just want to know what we can do, because there's so many people. Like if I get elected onto council, I'm just one councillor. And if I come in gung-ho on an issue, how do I stop the rest of the councillors then going, oh, she's just too gung-ho, we're going to vote against her? How do I get other people on side? A lot of people are going to say, oh, this is a state government issue, council can't do anything. How do I bridge that gap? How do I get the other people on council to step up and stand up on this issue?
This is a question, but I think this is an important one. So maybe if we get like a couple of brief responses.
You've got to make friends with other councillors. You've got to have lots of cups of tea, coffee, whatever it takes. You've got to do a lot of time outside of the chamber, talking to these people and befriending them.
Thank you, Carol. Michelle or Crystal?
Yes, I agree. You need to listen to your colleagues about what issues are important to them. You have to take the kicks. Sometimes they'll vote against your projects, but have the long-term goals in mind and be willing to stay the course. But building relationships and having respect for your other colleagues is important.
And I certainly would think about, if I run for council again, running with a block of people to improve the capacity to get sufficient votes on the floor.
I wholeheartedly agree with that advice. You can do nothing in any level of government. It's a salient lesson that you learn pretty quickly. So you need friends, but you need them to understand your position on policy and you need to appreciate theirs. The strongest decisions are considered decision. In other words, everyone in the chamber agrees. That means the staff, the administration in totality, including the CEO, will know that there's no opposition whatsoever. A chamber where you simply get over the line by one vote means that the decision can be rescinded, that means overturned, or the staff will think, this could be different next year or the next term of council. To have really powerful change, you need to get everyone on board, and that means a lot of listening, a lot of tactical work, and really trying to understand what the community sentiment is. Because if you're reflecting that in your comments, the rest of the elected members will get on board because they think that's what everybody wants to do, and you'll have a very powerful approach. You have to be very careful of being a lone voice in these topics because it's easy to dismiss someone who sounds a bit mad, to be frank, and you just can't. You've got to do this from the heart and from a community perspective, then you can be really powerful.
Thank you very much, David. All right, we could easily go for another hour, but I think we are going to have to wrap up. Huge thanks to everyone who's contributed tonight, like including our 4 opening presentations. Shane from the Parklands Association, Marty from the Western Adelaide Coastal Residents Association, Michelle Hogan from the Port Adelaide Enfield National Trust, and Diane from the Community Alliance. But of course, on top of that, we heard from a number of advocates, current mayors and councillors, ex-councillors, current candidates. The National Trust recorded tonight's presentation, so we will send out those presentations as quickly as possible. This is sort of the start of a conversation, and I think the start of, I know Carol and quite a few others mentioned the importance of unity, us working together even when we're not on the same page on every single issue. That's the plan. We have definitely got to continue these conversations right past the council elections and right through over spring and summer. If we don't have your contact details, post them in the Zoom chat and we'll make sure that you get all the information that comes out of tonight and you hear about future events and other campaign opportunities. So thank you all of you for giving up 90 minutes of your night, and I'm sure we'll see all of you on Zoom or in real life very soon. Thank you very much.
Paz, I just want to say thank you very much for organising this for us all. And I think bringing together a group of like-minded people is really important, and appreciate the work that you've done to make this happen. So thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Have a good night, folks. See you
Bye-bye,
later.
everybody.